The message arrived on an ordinary afternoon. The kind of afternoon that feels invisible until something shatters it forever. I was sitting alone at the small dining table, a cup of tea growing cold beside me, when my phone vibrated softly against the wood. I expected nothing important, maybe a delivery alert, maybe a distant relative checking in. Instead, I saw my son's name on the screen. For a brief second, my heart lifted. No matter how old your child gets, a message from them still feels like a small blessing. I opened it without hesitation, unprepared for how deeply a few words could wound. Don't expect me to take care of you in old age. I read it once, then again, and again, each time hoping the meaning would somehow change, soften, explain itself. But it didn't. The words stayed exactly as they were, cold, direct, and final. My hands began to shake, not dramatically, but in that quiet way where your body reacts before your mind can catch up. I stared at the screen until the letters blurred, until the room felt too silent to breathe in. For years, I had told myself that distance between parents and children was normal, that life gets busy, that love doesn't always show up the way it used to. But this wasn't distance. This was rejection, written plainly, without apology. I tried to think of what I might have done to deserve it. I replayed memories like old films. Every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every time I chose my son's needs over my own. None of it seemed to matter now. I remembered the day he was born, how impossibly small his fingers were wrapped around mine, as if the world had entrusted him to me alone. I remembered promising myself that I would always be there for him, no matter how hard life became. I kept that promise. I worked longer hours than my body could handle. I skipped vacations, ignored my own illnesses, and told myself rest could wait. Everything could wait, except my child's future. When his father passed away, the world tilted beneath my feet. Grief became my shadow, following me into every room. But I didn't let it consume me, because I had a son to raise alone. I learned how to be both parents at once. I learned how to hide my exhaustion behind smiles, how to stretch a single paycheck into something that looked like stability. I believed, perhaps foolishly, that love planted with such care would one day grow into understanding. The years passed quietly. My son grew up, moved out, built a life that no longer included daily calls or weekend visits. I told myself this was success, that independence meant I had done my job right. Even when loneliness crept into the evenings, I pushed it away. This is normal, I said. This is how life goes. But the message on my phone told a different story, one I wasn't ready to accept. I tried to reply. I really did. I typed, deleted, typed again. Every version sounded wrong. Too defensive, too desperate, too weak. I didn't want to beg for compassion. I didn't want to guilt him with the past. All I wanted was to understand how love could turn into something so distant, so transactional. When did care become a burden instead of a bond? That night, sleep refused to come. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the clock mark each second with cruel precision. The house felt larger than it ever had before, filled with echoes of a life once shared. In the silence, questions grew louder. Was this how it ends? Was I supposed to grow old preparing for solitude instead of support? Had I failed as a mother without realizing it? By morning, the shock had settled into something heavier. Acceptance mixed with quiet fear. Aging suddenly felt real in a way it never had before. Not because of wrinkles or aching joints, but because the safety net I assumed existed had been pulled away without warning. I realized then that this story wasn't just about a message. It was about the fragile expectations we carry for decades, believing love will always come back to us in the end. And as I sat there, holding my untouched tea once more, I understood that this was only the beginning, because before I could respond to my son, I needed to confront a far more difficult truth. What happens when the people you sacrificed everything for decide they owe you nothing at all? The days that followed my son's message moved slowly, as if time itself had decided to punish me by dragging every moment out. I went through my routine on autopilot, washing dishes that were already clean, folding laundry that didn't need folding, sitting by the window just to feel like I was waiting for something. Anything. But no message came. No explicación. Just silence, heavier than the words he had sent. I told myself not to take it personally. People say cruel things when they're stressed, I reasoned. Maybe he was having a bad day. Maybe work was overwhelming him. Maybe this wasn't truly how he felt. But deep down I knew better. Those words hadn't been typed in anger or haste. They were measured, deliberate, and painfully clear. He had drawn a boundary, and I was standing on the wrong side of it. I thought about calling him. My fingers hovered over his contact name more than once. Each time, fear stopped me. What if he didn't answer? What if he repeated the same sentence out loud? This time with a voice I used to recognize. I wasn't sure my heart could survive hearing it spoken. So instead, I stayed quiet, hoping distance might soften what words had hardened. Memories have a way of surfacing when you least expect them. I found myself remembering the nights I stayed awake beside his bed when he had fevers, whispering reassurances even though I was terrified myself. I remembered parent-teacher meetings, scraped knees, broken dreams, and small victories we celebrated with cheap takeout and laughter. I had been there for every version of him. The scared child, the angry teenager, the ambitious young man. And yet, here I was, reduced to someone he felt the need to warn away from his future. One afternoon, a neighbor stopped me in the hallway and asked, casually, how my son was doing. I smiled automatically and said, "He's busy but he's fine." The lie slipped out easily, practiced from years of protecting a story I wanted to believe in. As soon as I closed my door behind me, the smile vanished. I slid down against the wall and let the weight of pretending press into my chest. What frightened me most wasn't just the rejection. It was the realization that I had built my future on an assumption. I had never demanded anything from my son, never spoken out loud about expectations. But somewhere deep inside, I believed that love created responsibility, that care flowed naturally both ways. Now I was forced to confront the possibility that I had mistaken devotion for security. That night, I finally responded. Not with anger. Not with guilt. Just honesty. I wrote that his message had hurt me, that I had never expected repayment for being his mother, but that I had hoped for compassion. I read it over carefully, removing anything that sounded like accusation. When I sent it, my hands trembled again. Not with shock this time, but with vulnerability. Hours passed. Then a day. Then two. No reply. In that silence, something inside me began to shift. I stopped replaying the message and started listening to myself instead. I asked questions I had avoided for years. Who was I, beyond being someone's mother? What did my life look like if I stopped waiting for validation from someone who no longer wanted to give it? These questions scared me, but they also sparked something unfamiliar: strength. I realized how much of my identity I had wrapped around my son's future, how little space I had left for my own. Every plan I made included him in some way, even when he wasn't physically present. Letting go of that vision felt like mourning a second loss, quieter but just as real. Yet with that loss came clarity. I could not force love. I could not negotiate care. And I could not keep shrinking myself to remain acceptable. One evening, as I sat alone watching the sun dip below the horizon, I made a decision. I would stop chasing explanations. I would stop measuring my worth by someone else's willingness to show up. My son had made his position clear. Now it was my turn to decide how I would live with that truth. This wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. It was something more basic: self-preservation. I began to understand that aging didn't have to mean becoming dependent, nor did it mean begging for a place in someone else's life. There were other paths forward, ones I had ignored because I assumed I wouldn't need them. And as painful as it was to admit, I knew this story wasn't just about him anymore. It was about me learning to stand in a future I never planned for, discovering what strength looks like when expectations fall apart, and preparing myself for a conversation that, when it finally came, would change everything. In the weeks that followed, I began doing something that felt almost rebellious. I started planning my life without asking for permission, even from the people who had once defined it. At first, the changes were small. I joined a morning walking group at the park, mostly retirees like me, each of us carrying our own quiet history. We didn't ask many questions. We just walked, shared the weather, laughed at stiff knees, and for the first time in a long while, I felt seen without being evaluated. I stopped waiting for my phone to light up with his name. Instead, I filled my days intentionally. I reorganized the house, not as an act of distraction, but as a form of reclaiming space. Every drawer I cleared felt symbolic, as if I was making room not just in my home, but in myself. I realized how many decisions I had postponed, assuming my son would eventually weigh in. Now his silence made those choices mine alone. Still, the pain didn't disappear. It surfaced unexpectedly, in grocery store aisles when I reached for his favorite cereal, or when I passed a bookstore and remembered the novels he used to borrow from my shelves. Love doesn't evaporate just because expectations collapse. It lingers, reshaping itself into something quieter, heavier, more complicated. One afternoon, I met with an old friend I hadn't seen in years. Over coffee, she spoke candidly about her own children, about how adulthood had changed their relationships in ways she never anticipated. She told me something that stayed with me long after we parted. We raised them to survive without us, but no one prepares us for surviving without them. It wasn't bitter. It was honest. And for the first time, I didn't feel alone in my grief. I started attending a local workshop on financial planning for seniors. Sitting in that room, I confronted realities I had avoided. I learned about options, community living, long-term care plans, independence supported by preparation rather than reliance. It wasn't the future I had imagined, but it was a future I could shape. And there was power in that realization, even if it came wrapped in sorrow. Late one night, unable to sleep, I reread my son's message. This time, I didn't read it as a rejection. I read it as information. Painful, yes, but clarifying. It told me what not to expect, and oddly enough, that knowledge steadied me. Hope based on illusion is fragile. Clarity, even when harsh, is grounding. A month later, my son finally replied. His message was short, careful, and distant. He said he hadn't meant to sound cruel, that life was complicated, that he had his own responsibilities now. He didn't apologize. He didn't ask how I was. I stared at the screen for a long time, realizing that this was likely the most honesty he could offer. And I had to decide whether I would keep hoping for more or accept what was. I chose acceptance, not because it hurt less but because it allowed me to move forward. I replied kindly, without pleading or reproach. I told him I understood that life pulls us in different directions, that I wished him well. And when I pressed send, something inside me finally unclenched. I wasn't begging anymore. I was letting go. That choice didn't make me stronger overnight. Some days, loneliness still crept in quietly, settling beside me like an unwelcome companion. But it no longer defined me. I was learning to sit with it without collapsing. I began volunteering at a community center, mentoring younger women who were navigating transitions of their own. In helping them, I found pieces of myself I thought I had lost. I started to see my life not as a waiting room, but as an open road. One that required courage to walk alone, but offered unexpected beauty along the way. My son's absence had forced me to confront uncomfortable truths, but it also freed me from living on borrowed expectations. And as I stood at the edge of this unfamiliar chapter, I understood something deeply for the first time. My worth was never dependent on who would take care of me later. It was rooted in who I was now, in the choices I made, and in the strength I found when love didn't return the way I expected. This wasn't the ending I had planned, but it was the beginning of something honest, something real, and in its own quiet way, something powerful. As the months passed, something unexpected happened. The silence that once felt unbearable slowly turned into space. Space where I could finally hear my own thoughts without interruption. I began noticing how much of my life had revolved around anticipating other people's needs, especially my son's. His moods, his plans, his approval. Without realizing it, I had trained myself to orbit around him. Now, with that center gone, I had to learn how to stand on my own gravity. I started writing again. Not letters meant to be sent, but pages meant to be felt. Every morning, I sat by the window with a cup of tea and wrote whatever surfaced. memories, regrets, small victories, questions I never asked out loud. Some days the words came easily. Other days I stared at the page, letting the ache speak in its own quiet way. Writing didn't erase the pain, but it gave it shape. And shaped pain is easier to carry. Around that time, my health demanded attention. A routine checkup revealed issues I had ignored for too long. Symptoms I brushed aside because someone else's life always seemed more urgent than mine. Sitting in the doctor's office, I felt a wave of fear. Not just of illness, but of facing it alone. Yet, as the doctor explained treatment options, I felt something else too: resolve. If no one else was going to prioritize me, I would. Recovery forced me to slow down. I learned to listen to my body, to rest without guilt, to accept help when it was offered. Neighbors checked in. Friends brought soup. The kindness I received reminded me that family doesn't always share your blood. Sometimes it shares your burdens. One afternoon, while sorting through old photographs, I found pictures of my son as a child. His crooked smile, scraped knees, the way he used to cling to my leg when he was afraid. I cried then, not from longing, but from acknowledgement. I had loved deeply. I had shown up. Whatever had changed between us did not erase that truth. Love given sincerely never becomes a mistake. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine a future not centered on reconciliation. Not because I had given up hope entirely, but because I no longer wanted my happiness held hostage by it. I researched travel groups for seniors, signed up for a short trip I had postponed for years, and felt a flutter of excitement mixed with fear. Stepping into something new at this stage of life felt radical, almost defiant. During that trip, surrounded by strangers who would soon become companions, I realized how many stories exist beyond our own pain. Each person carried loss, reinvention, resilience. Listening to them, I felt my perspective widen. My life wasn't over. It was simply evolving. One evening, sitting by the ocean, I received another message from my son. This one was different, less guarded, more uncertain. He asked how I was doing. Just that. A simple question that once would have sent my heart racing. This time, I took a deep breath before responding. I told him the truth. Not the polished version meant to reassure him, nor the wounded version meant to guilt him. I told him I was learning, adjusting, finding my way. His reply was slow, thoughtful. He admitted he didn't know how to balance his life yet, that fear had made him say things he couldn't take back. There was no grand apology, no emotional breakthrough, but there was something fragile and real beginning to form. And I realized that reconciliation, if it ever came, would have to be built gently, without forcing, without expectations. I no longer needed him to promise care in my old age. I needed honesty in the present. And that, perhaps, was something we could still work toward. Returning home, I noticed how different the house felt. It no longer echoed with absence. It reflected growth. I rearranged furniture, donated items that no longer served me, planted new flowers in the garden. Each change was intentional, symbolic of the life I was actively shaping rather than passively enduring. I wasn't healed. Healing isn't a destination you arrive at fully intact. It's a process of choosing yourself again and again, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it feels lonely, even when the people you love don't show up the way you hoped. But I was stronger. Not hardened, stronger in the quiet sense. The kind of strength that comes from surviving disappointment without losing compassion. From accepting reality without surrendering dignity. And as I stood in this new chapter, I understood something profoundly important. Independence is not the absence of love. It is the presence of self-respect. And that, finally, was something I was no longer willing to compromise. Life has a quiet way of testing the lessons we think we've already learned. Just when I began to feel steady in my new independence, another challenge arrived. Not dramatic, not loud, but deeply revealing. It came in the form of everyday decisions. The kind that used to involve asking someone else first. Should I sell the house? Should I downsize? Should I stay close to familiar streets or take a risk and move somewhere new? For the first time in decades, there was no one whose opinion outweighed my own. At first, that freedom felt heavy. I stood in the middle of the living room one evening, surrounded by memories soaked into the walls, and realized how much of my identity was tied to this space. This was where my son took his first steps, where birthdays were celebrated, arguments whispered behind closed doors, holidays passed in predictable routines. Letting go felt like erasing proof that my life had mattered. But staying out of fear felt just as wrong. I decided to take my time. Instead of rushing toward an answer, I allowed myself to live inside the questions. I visited nearby towns, imagined different versions of myself in different settings. In one, I lived near the sea, waking to the sound of waves. In another, I was closer to friends, laughter filling smaller rooms. Each possibility taught me something about what I valued now, not what I valued as a wife or a mother, but as a woman standing on her own. During this period, my relationship with my son remained fragile but present. Our conversations were careful, measured. We avoided old wounds, spoke about neutral things, weather, work, shared memories that felt safe. I noticed how he listened differently now, as if realizing for the first time that I existed beyond the role he had assigned me. And I noticed how I spoke differently too, no longer seeking permission to exist. One afternoon he mentioned feeling overwhelmed. Not by me, but by life, responsibilities piling up, expectations pressing in from all sides. In that moment, something shifted. I recognized the exhaustion in his voice. The same exhaustion I once carried silently. I didn't rush to fix it. I simply listened. And that, I realized, was a new kind of motherhood. One that didn't sacrifice itself to be useful. As weeks turned into months, I made a decision about the house. Not a dramatic one, but a deliberate one. I chose to sell. Not because I was running from the past, but because I was making room for the future. Packing was emotional. Each box held a version of me I had once been. I thanked those versions quietly and let them go. Moving day was surprisingly calm. There were tears, yes, but there was also relief. My new place was smaller, brighter, easier to care for. It felt like a reflection of my life now. Simpler, intentional, honest. I arranged my books by the window, hung only the photos that brought me peace, and for the first time, decorated a home entirely for myself. In this new chapter, I discovered joys I had postponed for years. I joined a local group, volunteered again, took classes purely out of curiosity rather than obligation. I laughed more freely, slept better. I wasn't waiting anymore for approval, for reconciliation, for someone else to decide when my life could begin again. Then came an unexpected moment of clarity. My son visited. Not for a holiday, not out of duty, but simply to see me. He walked through my new home slowly, observing the changes, the absence of familiar clutter. Finally, he said something simple but profound. "You seem lighter." And I realized he was right. We talked that evening more openly than we had in years. Not everything was resolved. Some conversations were still too tender to touch. But there was respect now. Space for each of us to be who we were, not who we expected the other to be. When he left, I didn't feel empty. I felt complete. I had learned something essential. Love doesn't require self-erasure. Connection doesn't demand sacrifice without limits. And family, when healthy, allows growth in both directions. As I closed the door behind him, I stood in the quiet of my new home and felt gratitude. Not for the pain that shaped me, but for the strength it revealed. I had faced rejection without becoming bitter. I had chosen dignity over desperation. And in doing so, I reclaimed a part of myself I thought was lost forever. This chapter wasn't about endings. It was about ownership. Of my time, my space, my worth. And for the first time in a very long while, the future didn't scare me. It invited me. Time has a way of softening sharp edges, but it also brings clarity. In the weeks after my son's visit, I noticed something new growing inside me. Not hope exactly, but confidence. The quiet kind. The kind that doesn't announce itself, but changes the way you walk into a room. I no longer checked my phone with a knot in my stomach. I no longer rehearsed conversations in my head, preparing myself for disappointment. I had finally learned how to sit comfortably with myself. Living alone taught me how much noise I had been carrying for years. Not the noise of arguments or chaos, but the constant hum of obligation. Wake up early because someone else needs you. Stay quiet because peace matters more than truth. Compromise until you forget what your own voice sounds like. In the silence of my new home, that noise faded, and what remained was startlingly clear. I had spent decades being strong for everyone except myself. One morning, while sipping tea by the window, I found an old notebook tucked inside a drawer. It was filled with lists, reminders, plans that never happened, dreams postponed for later, travel ideas scribbled quickly, creative thoughts abandoned halfway. I ran my fingers over the pages and felt a familiar sadness, but it didn't stay long. This time, sadness turned into resolve. Later had finally arrived. I started small. Day trips. Long walks without checking the time. Conversations with strangers that didn't require explanation. I learned that reinvention doesn't have to be dramatic. Sometimes it's just choosing differently, one quiet decision at a time. I stopped apologizing for my needs. I stopped shrinking my emotions to keep others comfortable. And slowly, the world responded differently. My relationship with my son continued to evolve. There were still awkward moments, pauses where neither of us knew what to say. But there was honesty now. One evening, he admitted something that surprised me. He said he never realized how much pressure his words had carried. He thought independence meant cutting ties, not understanding that independence could also mean respect. I listened without interrupting, without defending myself. That too was new. Forgiveness didn't arrive like a sudden wave. It came gradually in pieces. Not because he asked for it, but because I no longer wanted to carry the weight of resentment. Forgiveness, I learned, isn't about excusing behavior. It's about releasing control. About choosing peace over proving a point. There were moments, of course, when loneliness crept in. Evenings when the quiet felt too large. Holidays that reminded me of traditions that no longer existed. But loneliness was different now. It didn't feel like abandonment. It felt like space. Space to feel, to grieve, to grow. And I filled that space intentionally, with books, music, community, and rest. One afternoon, a neighbor invited me for coffee. We talked about life, about starting over later than expected. She said something that stayed with me. We think our stories end when roles change. But sometimes that's when they finally begin. I walked home thinking about that sentence, realizing how true it felt in my bones. For years, I had defined myself through service. Wife, mother, caregiver. When those roles shifted, I thought I had lost my purpose. But purpose doesn't disappear. It transforms. Mine transformed into something quieter, but stronger. I began mentoring younger women, sharing what I had learned. Not advice, but truth. About boundaries. About self-worth. About choosing yourself without guilt. One night, my son sent me a message. Not a demand. Not an obligation. Just a simple check-in. I smiled when I read it. Not because everything was perfect, but because it was genuine. We were no longer bound by expectations. We were connected by choice. As I turned off the lights and prepared for bed, I caught my reflection in the mirror. There were lines on my face, yes. Signs of years lived fully and imperfectly. But there was also something else. Peace. The kind that comes from knowing you survived what you once thought would break you. I realized then that growing older isn't about becoming smaller. It's about becoming more yourself. Less afraid. Less willing to settle. More honest about what you deserve. And for the first time since that painful message changed everything, I understood this truth completely. I was never asking for too much. I was just asking the wrong people. There is a quiet moment that comes after survival. A space where you are no longer fighting to stay afloat, but you're not quite celebrating either. That's where I found myself. Balance between what I had lost and what I was still learning to gain. Healing, I discovered, isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself with fireworks or sudden happiness. It shows up in small ways. How you breathe, how you sleep, how you respond when old wounds are gently touched. One afternoon, I received an invitation in the mail. A community center nearby was hosting a storytelling circle for seniors. Normally, I would have tossed it aside, convincing myself I didn't belong or that my story wasn't important enough. But something inside me nudged forward instead of pulling back. I went. And for the first time, I spoke my story out loud, not as a victim, but as a woman who had lived, endured, and chosen herself. As I spoke, I noticed nods around the room. Quiet understanding. No interruptions. No judgments. Just shared humanity. When I finished, there was silence. Not uncomfortable, but full. One woman reached for my hand and said, "I thought I was alone in this." That moment changed me more than I expected. It reminded me that pain isolates, but truth connects. From that day on, I became a regular, listening to stories that mirrored mine in unexpected ways. Children who drifted away, marriages that quietly dissolved, dreams delayed, then rediscovered. We laughed more than we cried, which surprised me. Humor, I learned, is a form of resilience. It's how the heart stretches instead of breaking. My son noticed the change in me before I did. During one of our phone calls, he said, "You sound different." I asked him what he meant. He paused, then said, "Stronger, but calmer." I smiled at that. Strength had always been something I associated with endurance. Now I understood it could also mean softness without surrender. Our conversations grew more natural, less guarded. We didn't avoid the past, but it no longer controlled us. When disagreements surfaced, we didn't rush to win. We listened. Sometimes that was enough. Sometimes it wasn't. But the difference was this: we were no longer trying to rewrite each other. We were simply learning how to coexist with respect. I also began to understand something important about boundaries. They are not punishments. They are invitations, guidelines that show others how to treat you. For years, I had believed love meant limitless availability. But real love, I realized, includes limits. It includes honesty. It includes the courage to say no, without explaining yourself. There were still moments of grief. Late nights when memories resurfaced. Times when I missed the version of my son, who once needed me for everything. But grief didn't scare me anymore. I let it pass through instead of fighting it. I allowed myself to mourn what was gone without denying what still existed. One evening, while organizing old photos, I came across a picture of myself from years ago. I barely recognized the woman smiling back. Tired eyes, forced cheerfulness. I compared it to the reflection staring at me now. Older, yes, but undeniably freer. That comparison filled me with compassion, not regret. I whispered a quiet thank you to my younger self for surviving long enough to bring me here. The truth is, aging had been painted as a decline, a slow erasing. But my experience told a different story. Aging stripped away illusions. It sharpened my sense of what mattered. It taught me that worth doesn't expire. That relevance isn't measured by how useful you are to others, but by how deeply you live in alignment with yourself. I began planning, not obligations but desires. A short solo trip. A writing workshop. Simple joys I once postponed because they didn't serve anyone else. And with each plan, I felt a growing excitement, not fear. I wasn't running away from my life. I was finally stepping into it. Late one night, I received a message from my son. He thanked me for my patience, my honesty, my strength. Not the strength that sacrifices silently, but the strength that stands upright. I didn't cry when I read it. I smiled, because I no longer needed validation to feel complete. But receiving it without pain felt like a gift. As I closed my phone and sat in the stillness, I understood something deeply. My life had not ended when I was told I wouldn't be cared for. It had expanded. I was no longer waiting to be chosen. I had chosen myself, and everything after that was a bonus. There is a strange peace that arrives when you stop waiting for permission to live. It doesn't come all at once. It settles quietly, like morning light slipping through curtains you forgot to close. That was how my final transformation began. Not with a dramatic confrontation or grand apology, but with acceptance. Acceptance of who I was, who I had been, and who I was still becoming. I stopped rehearsing old arguments in my head. Stopped imagining conversations that would never happen. I no longer needed my son to fully understand my pain in order to heal from it. Understanding, I realized, is not a requirement for peace. Release is. One Sunday morning, I cooked breakfast just for myself. No rules. No expectations. I set the table the way I liked it, not the way I thought it should look for others. As I sat down, I noticed something surprising. I felt content. Not lonely. Not abandoned. Simply complete in that moment. That feeling stayed with me longer than I expected. Later that week, my son visited. There was no tension when he walked through the door. No invisible scorecard between us. We spoke easily, about ordinary things, whether work, memories that no longer carried sharp edges. When he hugged me goodbye, it felt genuine, unforced. And that mattered more than any apology ever could. I didn't suddenly become invisible to pain. But pain no longer defined me. I learned that forgiveness isn't always about the other person. Sometimes it's about freeing yourself from carrying a weight that was never meant to be yours forever. I began volunteering again, not out of duty, but desire. Helping others reminded me of my own resilience. I met people who were still in the thick of their struggles. And instead of offering advice, I offered presence. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is, I see you. One afternoon, a woman younger than me asked how I found the courage to start over at my age. I laughed softly and told her the truth. I didn't start over. I continued. I simply stopped shrinking myself to fit into spaces that no longer valued me. That night, I wrote a letter to myself. Not to my son. Not to my past. To me. I thanked myself for staying. For surviving the moments when it would have been easier to disappear emotionally. For choosing growth instead of bitterness. I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer, knowing I might never read it again, but writing it was enough. As time passed, I noticed how differently I moved through the world. Straighter posture, clearer voice, softer heart. I no longer mistook endurance for love or silence for loyalty. I understood that respect, real respect, never demands your erasure. My son and I still have our differences. We always will. But now they exist without cruelty, without fear, without threats of abandonment. And that alone feels like a miracle. Sometimes, late at night, I think about the message that once shattered me. The words that made me believe I was disposable. I no longer feel anger when I remember them. Instead, I feel gratitude, because they force me to confront a truth I had avoided for too long. My worth was never dependent on being needed. I am needed by myself. And that is enough. If there is one thing I hope you take from my story, it is this. Life does not end when others withdraw their care. It begins again when you reclaim your own. No matter your age. No matter your past. No matter how small the world has tried to make you feel. You are not a burden. You are not expired. You are not invisible. You are still here. And that means your story is not over. Mine certainly isn't.